The candles in the Ravenhill drawing-room had been burning for 2 hours when Lady Dorothea Ashworth rose from her chair and held a single folded page toward the assembled company, as though it were a letter from a court of law. The paper was Georgiana's. She knew it the moment she saw it. Knew it by the particular fold at the left corner where she always pressed her thumb. Knew it by the ink's quality, which was slightly too dark, because she had been borrowing from the writing table in Lady Marin's sitting room, and the pen there ran heavy. 7 guests sat arranged in the candlelight. Miss Cecily Brant occupied the chair nearest the fire, her ivory gown catching every available warmth. The Duke stood at the far end of the room with his back half turned, looking into the cold hearth as though he had not noticed the gathering sudden change of weather. Lady Dorothea's voice was measured and pleasant. It was always measured and pleasant. She read 2 sentences from the page, aloud, sentences Georgiana had written about a woman standing at a window watching a man she could not name her feeling for, and the room received the reading in a silence that had weight to it, the particular weight of a verdict being assembled. Georgiana stood near the door. She had not been seated. Companions were not always seated. She watched the Duke's shoulders and waited to understand what his stillness meant. His face, in profile against the window glass, gave nothing. His jaw was set in that particular way she had learned to read as discipline rather than indifference, though in 7 weeks at Ravenhill she had not yet determined where discipline ended and indifference began. Lady Dorothea set the page on the side table with careful deliberateness, and looked at Georgiana with eyes that carried the mild, sorrowful expression of someone delivering a regrettable truth. What happened after that is best understood from the beginning. Georgiana Weber had come to Ravenhill in early September, 8 months after Lady Marin's first episode of the lung fever that refused to fully release her. She was 24 years old, and she had been a companion for 3 of those years. First, to an elderly baronet's wife in Somerset, who collected porcelain dogs and required a reader with precise diction, and then to Lady Marin, who was a distant relation through her mother's side, and who had specifically requested Georgiana on the grounds that she was quiet and did not rearrange furniture without being asked. She arrived by hired coach on a Thursday afternoon when the light across the North Yorkshire moors was the color of tarnished copper, and the estate presented itself to her through the coach window as a thing of austere, impartial grandeur, all pale stone and small-paned windows, and a gravel drive lined with copper beeches that had not yet finished releasing their leaves. She had a single trunk and a leather case that held her notebooks. The notebooks were the only things she had carried without interruption through 3 years of employment and 2 changes of address, and she handled the case with a care that was slightly in excess of its apparent value, because its value was not apparent. Mrs. Black Partlow met her at the servants' entrance, which was where companions were received at Ravenhill, neither through the front door like a guest, nor through the kitchen passage like a housemaid, but in that precise middle position the house had designated for people of uncertain belonging. Mrs. Partlow was a compact woman of 60, with gray hair pinned severely, and a manner that suggested she had seen everything that could happen inside a great house and had formed opinions about most of it. She showed Georgiana to a room on the 2nd floor, east-facing, with a narrow window and a writing table that was slightly too short for comfortable use. She told her that Lady Marin took her meals in her chamber and expected reading aloud between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, that the dining room was used for formal occasions only, and that the library was the Duke's private preserve and not available to household staff or companions. Georgiana noted the distinction without comment. She unpacked her trunk, placed her notebooks in the leather case under the writing table, and went to find Lady Marin. Lady Marin was 53, and smaller than her portrait in the upstairs corridor suggested. She was propped against a bank of pillows with a quilt drawn to her waist, and a look of determined cheerfulness that had clearly been maintained through considerable effort. She greeted Georgiana warmly, inquired after the journey, expressed relief that she had arrived before the autumn weather set in properly, and fell asleep mid-sentence before Georgiana had finished pouring the tea. In those first days, Georgiana established the rhythm of her employment. She read aloud to Lady Marin from whatever Marin requested, which was usually travel writing or natural history, and occasionally the novels of Mrs. Trix. Radcliffe when Marin was tired and needed something with forward motion. She managed correspondence when the lady was too fatigued to hold a pen. She sat with her during the physician's visits and took notes on the recommended treatments in a hand so neat and regular that the physician once commented on it to Lady Dorothea, who was also present, though Lady Dorothea had only smiled and said that Georgiana was very useful. She was not invited to dinner. She was occasionally invited to sit in the drawing room when Lady Dorothea held small afternoon gatherings, where her function was to make the numbers even, and to ensure there was always someone available to fetch a dropped item without requiring a footman to be summoned from across the room. She understood this. She had understood it since Somerset. The library she discovered by accident on her 5th day, in the grey early morning before the house was properly awake, following a passage she had not yet explored. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stood in the threshold for 30 seconds without entering, taking in the scale of it 2 full stories of shelved volumes, a gallery running around the upper level with a brass railing, 3 long reading tables, and windows facing north that admitted a cool, even light even at this hour. The smell of it reached her before anything else: paper and leather and the faint mineral scent of old bindings, a smell she associated with the best hours of her life. She entered. She spent 40 minutes at the shelves before she heard the first sounds of the house waking, and retreated to her room. She went back the following morning, and the morning after that. She told herself it was harmless. No one had explicitly told her not to use the library at 6 in the morning, Mrs. Hartlow having specified that the library was unavailable to companions, which Georgiana had interpreted as unavailable during the hours when the Duke might wish to use it himself, and the Duke, she had gathered from 3 weeks of observation, never rose before 9. On the 11th morning she brought her notebook. She wrote at the north-facing window with the grey light falling across the page, and the sound of nothing but the estate beginning its quiet morning business below. She wrote 3 pages of a story she had been carrying in her head for most of a year. A story about a woman who has learned to make herself invisible, and one day finds that the wrong person has finally seen her. She had never intended it for anyone. She had been writing it the way some people talk to themselves in empty rooms, because the act of setting it down was the only space she had that belonged entirely to her. She left the notebook on the table when she went to retrieve a particular volume of botanical illustration she wanted to reference, and while she was at the far shelves, she heard someone on the upper corridor, and startled and gathered her things too quickly, and did not realize until she was back in her room that one page had slipped free and been left behind, tucked half under a botany volume on the reading table. Lady Dorothea found it before 10 o'clock. She came to Georgiana's room without announcement. She was dressed for morning calls, and she held the single page between 2 fingers with the precise care of someone who finds the object slightly distasteful. She told Georgiana, in sentences of impeccable courtesy, that the library was not a place for the kind of private expression that companions might better confine to their own apartments, that the Duke's household maintained certain standards regarding the boundaries between the family's private spaces and those occupied by paid members of the household, and that in future Georgiana would find the drawing room and the morning room quite sufficient for any writing she wished to undertake. She did not return the page. Georgiana thanked her, met her eyes without wavering, and said she understood completely. She did not say that the drawing room and the morning room were never unoccupied before noon, that Lady Dorothea herself appeared in both rooms with reliable frequency, and that writing in either space would be precisely as private as writing in the middle of a public road. The library was gone. She had known it would not last. Things that belonged to her had a habit of being reclaimed. She managed for 12 days without it. She wrote in her room at the narrow table with her knees at the wrong angle, and the work felt different without the library's particular atmosphere, thinner and more anxious, as though the room's smallness infected the sentences. She tried the garden bench on fine days, but the outdoor light was too bright, and the pages felt exposed in the open air, which she recognized as irrational and could not help. On the 13th evening, after Lady Maren had fallen asleep and the house had settled into its 10 o'clock quiet, she took the botany volume from the shelf in her room, the one she had borrowed weeks earlier and not yet returned, and she went back down the corridor to the library. She was not going to stay. She was only going to replace the volume and perhaps write a single page first. She wrote 4 pages. She folded them carefully and placed them between the pressed plant illustrations in the center section of the botany volume, and left the volume on the second shelf from the bottom, 4th position from the left, where she could reach it without a ladder. She reasoned that no one would open a botany volume to look at pages of manuscript. She reasoned that she was harming nothing. She reasoned that she had very little else, and this reasoning silenced the other kind. She returned the following week, and the week after. By the 1st of October she had pressed 7 separate pages of manuscript into that volume, and she was writing the best work she had produced since she began writing, in the library's borrowed quiet with the cold north light crossing the page, writing about the woman at the window and the man whose stillness she was still learning to read. She had seen the Duke on perhaps a dozen occasions by this point. He moved through the house with the economy of a man who had decided long ago to waste nothing. Not time, not words, not expression. He was 38, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a face that would have been handsome if it had shown any inclination to be examined. He had spoken to Georgiana exactly 4 times. Once when she was in the corridor and he had asked how Lady Maren's breathing was today. Once when she had been present at a small dinner at which Lady Dorothea had placed her 2 seats below Miss Brant, and he had asked her opinion of the autumn weather in a tone that suggested he was fulfilling a social obligation rather than pursuing a conversation. Once when she had been reading aloud in Maren's room, and he had appeared in the doorway and stood there for a moment, before saying only that he would return later. And once, most recently, when she had passed him in the library corridor, at an hour. She should not have been there, and he had paused and looked at her, with an expression she could not categorize, and then walked on without speaking. The 4th occasion had unsettled her more than the other 3 combined. She did not permit herself to think about it with any sustained attention. She permitted herself to notice it, and then she set it aside. She was 24 years old and a companion, and her task was to be useful and unobtrusive, and the portion of her life that involved being noticed by anyone in particular had not begun and might never begin, and she was at peace with that. Or she was constructing something in the vicinity of peace, and doing a creditable job of living inside it. If you have found yourself holding your breath at some point in this telling, know that the story rewards the patience. Leave a word in the comments about what draws you to stories like this one, and then stay with Georgiana, because what happened next changed everything about what she had resigned herself to. On the 12th of October, the Duke entered the library at 7 in the morning. This was not his habit. His habit was to enter at 9 and to remain until noon, and the library's particular quality of morning solitude between 6 and 8 was the only thing that made Georgiana's visits feel workable. She had learned his hours by careful observation, the way one learns the schedule of a property one is trespassing on with the specific attentiveness of someone who cannot afford to be caught again. He entered at 7 because he could not sleep. He had not been sleeping well for 3 weeks, which was unusual, because for 3 years he had slept with the grim efficiency of a man who had decided that consciousness held nothing he wished to linger in. He had also not been entering the library at all for the past 3 years, except on business matters requiring a specific volume, and then only briefly and with the window shutters closed. He did not examine his reasons for entering now at the particular hour he was entering. He took a candle from the hall table and pushed the library door open and crossed directly to the reading tables, where a botany volume sat in the exact position it had occupied since he had last come to find something, and noticed it there, slightly too far from the shelf to have been placed by someone at full height without a ladder. He opened the cover. He found 7 pages of manuscript, written in a hand he did not immediately recognize, folded carefully between the illustrated plates. He read them where he stood, With the candle held in one hand, he read all 7. Then he went back to the first, and read them again from the beginning. The pages were a story about a woman who had learned to occupy the minimum possible space in every room she entered, and who had made a kind of practice of this, had cultivated it into a discipline. Until the day a man with extraordinary stillness turned and looked at her across a room, and she understood with cold clarity that she had been seen. Not noticed, seen. The distinction in the pages was precise, and the precision of it struck him in a way he had not been struck by a written thing in longer than he wished to calculate. The woman in the pages was afraid of being seen, and also below the fear, in a register the writer did not quite announce, but laid into the sentences like a thread of different material. She wanted it more than she had wanted anything in several years. He read them a third time. He set them back between the botanical plates and replaced the volume on the shelf, and he stood in the library for 20 minutes afterward with his hand on the brass railing of the reading table, and the room, which had been cold and empty to him for 3 years, was neither of those things exactly. He did not know who had written the pages. He suspected it was someone in the household. The handwriting was not a servant's hand. It was the hand of someone educated, someone who had been taught letter formation as a matter of some care, and who had developed her own particular pressures and angles over years of daily use. He thought he had seen that hand before but could not locate where. What he did not do was remove the pages or mention them to anyone. He returned the following morning, and the morning after, to see if there were more. There were not yet more, but there was a faint pencil note on the inside front cover of the Botany volume that had not been there before, a corrected Latin classification for one of the illustrated plants, written in the same hand. He had made the correction himself, in the same pencil, before he went to bed the night before, to see if the page's author would return. She had returned. She had corrected his correction, as it happened, because his correction had introduced a small error, and the page's author was apparently constitutionally unable to leave a small error uncorrected, even when it served her practical interest to ignore it. He stood in the library holding the Botany volume and felt something shift in his chest that was not grief, which had been the library's only resident sensation for 3 years. The story he had not told anyone, since the night it became his to carry, was this: his wife Clara had died in this library. She had been 31 years old, and she had been reading in the chair nearest the north window, her favorite place, and the fever had moved so quickly from ordinary illness to something the physician could not manage, that by the time Edmund had come downstairs she was barely conscious. She had died 2 days later without leaving that chair, because moving her had caused her pain, and he had refused to cause her pain for the sake of a more comfortable deathbed location. 3 years he had not sat in that chair. Since. He had not, if he were honest, entered this room with anything but the minimum necessary intention, and the pages had drawn him back in before he understood that was what was happening. He had thought he would not feel the loss differently than he felt it now. He had been wrong. Georgiana had no knowledge of this. She knew only that the Duke sometimes stood in the library in the early morning with an expression her pages could not quite capture, and that he was the most solitary person she had ever observed in a full household. She knew that Lady Dorothea watched him with the particular attention of someone whose own position depended on his remaining in a specific configuration, and that Miss Brant was invited to the estate with a frequency that went slightly beyond ordinary social hospitality. Lady Dorothea had mentioned Miss Brant's name in Georgiana's hearing on 3 distinct occasions. The first time, at an afternoon gathering in the drawing-room where Georgiana had been present to manage the tea service, Lady Dorothea had said to a neighbor's wife, in a tone of pleasant finality, that Miss Brant was exactly the kind of steadying influence the Ravenhill household had been missing these past 3 years. The second time, when Georgiana had been arranging Lady Marin's correspondence on a writing table in the corridor, and Lady Dorothea had passed with 2 house guests, she had said in a voice precisely calibrated to carry that it was a shame Edmund continued to surround himself with women of no particular standing available to him. The third time was at the autumn dinner itself, where Lady Dorothea had risen after the second course, with the drawing-room arranged around her and the candlelight striking the chandelier to its best effect, and introduced Miss Brant as the young woman we are all so very glad to welcome as a permanent presence at Ravenhill. She had not said intended. She had not said anything that could be quoted back. She was too accomplished for that. What she had done was position the introduction in such a way that 3 guests had turned to look at the Duke with an expectation that required a response, and Miss Brant had sat in the carved chair at the head of the arrangement with the composed pleasure of a woman who has been told exactly what the evening's staging requires and has prepared. Accordingly, Georgiana had been seated near the door. She had watched the Duke's face during the introduction. His expression was level and civil and gave her nothing, which was not unusual. But the stillness of his hands clasped on the table had a different quality from his usual stillness, tighter along the knuckle. When the company had shifted to conversation, and the configuration had relaxed, he turned from his position and looked down the table. His eyes found Georgiana, not Miss Brant. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he said, in the even tone he used for all direct address, "Miss Weber, you have been at Ravenhill for 7 weeks. Do you find the household's management of the autumn social calendar to be accurate in its representation of what is currently the case?" It was the strangest question she had heard in 7 weeks of strange adjacent questions. She said carefully, "I find it very well managed, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment longer. "That is a diplomatic answer. I am employed to be useful," she said. "Not to be accurate." Something moved at the edge of his expression. She could not name it. "A distinction worth noting," he said, and turned back to the table. Lady Dorothea, 2 seats away, had smiled at her plate. The witnessing happened 4 days later on an afternoon when the rain had made the upper corridor dark and the sound of it on the roof tiles was a constant low frequency, and Lady Maren had asked Georgiana, in the thin voice that appeared when she was particularly fatigued, if she would read something new today, something that was not natural history. Georgiana had paused at the bedside with a travel volume in her hand, and had thought for a moment, and then had set it down and taken her notebook from her pocket instead. She read from the manuscript. She read the passage she had written most recently, the one where the woman at the window watches the man cross the courtyard below and tries to name what she sees in him, not his rank or his bearing, but what lies behind those things, the specific quality of his solitude. The way he occupies space as though he has decided the world's ordinary comforts are not for him, and has arranged himself accordingly, and how she wants to give him back something he has lost without knowing that she sees it in him, without knowing whether her seeing is accurate or only her own longing, made legible. Maren had closed her eyes and listened, and her breathing had steadied, and her hands on the quilt had unclenched. Georgiana read for 20 minutes. She did not hear the door shift. Edmund had come to the upper corridor to retrieve a letter he had left with Maren's correspondence that morning. He had stopped outside the partly open door when he heard the voice, and then he had stood without entering, and listened to the passage being read aloud, and recognized the prose, and understood at once, with a clarity that left no room for revision, whose hand had written those 7 pages in the botany volume. He had stood for most of those 20 minutes in the corridor. He had not disturbed the reading. He went back to his study and sat for a long time at his desk, without lighting the lamp. The following day he sent a note to his solicitor in York, asking him to confirm the legal particulars of a question he had been turning over for several weeks without acting on it. The solicitor's reply arrived 3 days later, 2 days before Lady Dorothea produced the forged letter, and the Duke read it twice and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, where it remained. The pre-ball gathering was small. 8 people in the yellow drawing-room with the early November cold pressing against the window glass, and a fire that had been burning since noon. Lady Dorothea had arranged the seating with her usual precision. Georgiana in the outer chair nearest the far wall, Miss Brant beside the fire, in a gown of amber silk that caught the light warmly, and the Duke standing near the piano, where he had been standing for most of the evening. Lady Dorothea rose from her chair with a folded paper in one hand. She said that she hoped the company would forgive a brief moment of honesty, that she had in her concern for the Duke's household and its proper management come across some information that she felt it her duty to share, and that she was sorry to be the one to share it. She read from the letter. It was written in a hand that resembled Georgiana's but was not quite hers. A careful forgery that had captured the general character of the formation without the particular pressures, the specific way her letters turned at their senders. The letter claimed that Georgiana had been placing manuscript pages in the library's botany volume as a deliberate social strategy, that she had calculated the Duke's habits and known he would find them, and that her purpose in doing so was to position herself as a figure of romantic interest in the household. The room received this in the same weighted silence as the reading weeks ago. Lady Dorothea folded the letter with the same gentle deliberateness, and said that she was sure Georgiana had only been trying to improve her situation in the way available to a young woman of her particular circumstances, and that she hoped the matter could be resolved quietly and without any lasting unpleasantness for anyone. Georgiana's hands were in her lap. She had pressed them flat against her skirt to stop the slight trembling that had begun when the first sentences were read, and now she held them still by an act of concentrated will. She looked at Lady Dorothea and did not speak, because there was nothing she could say that would carry more weight than the letter had already claimed, and she knew it. She looked once at the Duke. His face was perfectly still. His eyes were on the letter. She rose from her chair, made the civil acknowledgment that the situation required, and left the room. She went up to her own chamber and sat for a long time at the short writing table. Lady Marin's illness had worsened in the past 10 days, the physician had said so yesterday, and Georgiana's formal reason for being at Ravenhill was already becoming uncertain. If Lady Marin died, or if Lady Marin recovered enough to no longer require a companion, the house would have no practical reason to retain her, and Lady Dorothea would have every reason to expedite her departure, and the library, which was already forbidden to her, would remain forbidden for the rest of her life. She had been seen, and it had been taken and made into something else. She sat with that for a full hour. She thought about the 7 pages in the botany volume and what they had been written for, which was nothing except the truth of what she had felt in this house and what she had found inside herself while she was writing it. She thought about the passage she had read to Lady Marin and the way Marin's hands had unclenched. She took out her notebook. She wrote one final page. She wrote it slowly, at the short table in her room, not in the library, not in the early morning gray light, but at 10 o'clock at night, with a single candle and the November cold through the window glass, and the knowledge that this was the last thing she would write in this house. She wrote about what it had felt like to be given the library and then to have it taken, and what it had felt like to write there anyway, at night, folding the pages into a botany volume and trusting them to the shelf, and what it had meant to read those pages aloud to a woman who needed an hour of peace. And what had mattered about all of it was simply that it had existed, that she had written it, and it was real, and no forged letter could make it into strategy, because she had written it the way she wrote everything, which was because she could not do otherwise. She folded the page. She went down the corridor to the library at 10:30. She placed the page on the reading table, not hidden in a botany volume but in plain sight on the center of the table where it could not be missed. Then she went back to her room and began, methodically, to pack her trunk. She was still packing the following evening when Mrs. Partlow knocked at her door. The autumn ball was not a large occasion by Ravenhill's historical standards. 40 guests had been assembled in the main drawing room and the adjoining gallery. The chandeliers had been lit to full height, and the musicians were arranged at the end of the room nearest the door. Miss Brant was present in the same amber silk, refreshed with new lace at the collar, and Lady Dorothea was positioned near the center of the room in the manner of someone who is managing the space rather than attending it. The Duke entered at 9 o'clock. He crossed the room in 8 strides, without pausing for greetings on either side, which was not his custom, and which caused a ripple of noticed attention to move through the company before he had reached the far end. He was carrying a page of manuscript. He reached the space near the fireplace where the candelabra threw the most light, and he turned to face the room. He waited until the room was attending him. This took approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, in the level carrying voice he used for things that required no emphasis to be felt, "I would like to read something to you." He read the page Georgiana had left on the table. He read it without theatrical effect, simply and at a steady pace, the way one reads a thing that does not need assistance, and the room, which had been a room of social calculation and amber silk and the careful management of impressions, became, for 3 minutes, something else. He read the passage about writing in the borrowed quiet of a forbidden room, about folding the pages and trusting them to the shelf, about reading aloud to a woman who needed an hour of peace. He read the final sentence, which said that what mattered was not whether anyone found the pages, but that the pages had been real, and the feeling behind them had been real. And that was sufficient, which was the thing she had taught herself to believe, because she had never expected anything else. He lowered the page. The room was very quiet. Candlelight moved on the ceiling. He said, "The author of this page is Miss Georgiana Weber, who has been companion to Lady Marin in this house for the past 9 weeks. She has been writing in the library at Ravenhill since her first week in this household, in the early morning, before anyone else was awake, because the library is the kind of room that makes good work possible, and she is the kind of person who does good work. I read her manuscript before I knew it was hers. I have now read everything she has written here, and I know it is hers, and I would like to say in this company that the pages left in the botany volume were not strategy. They were simply the best writing this library has held in quite some time." Lady Dorothea, from her position near the center of the room, said in a voice whose pleasantness had gone slightly thin at the edges, "Edmund, surely now is not the moment." He looked at her across the room, not unkindly, with the precision of someone who has spent 3 weeks deciding what to say. "Lady Dorothea," he said, "the letter you presented last evening was not in Miss Weber's hand. I have seen her correspondence across 9 weeks of household management, routed through Lady Marin, and the formation of the ascending letters was not hers. I make no accusation. I state an observable fact." The room held itself very still. Lady Dorothea's fan, which she had been holding at a steady height throughout the evening, descended by 2 inches. That was all. But the room saw it, and the room understood it. Miss Brant, seated near the fire, looked at her hands in her lap. Edmund turned and crossed the room toward the door. He paused at the threshold and addressed the nearest footman by name, asking him to request that Mrs. Burst Partlow send word to Miss Weber that the drawing-room required her presence, if she was willing, and that the message was from the Duke directly. Mrs. Partlow had anticipated this. She had in fact been standing in the corridor outside the drawing-room for the past 20 minutes. Because she had been in this house for 31 years, she knew what the Duke's particular quality of determined movement generally preceded, and she had wanted to be useful in whatever capacity the situation required. She had, also, 3 days earlier, seen the manuscript page on the library reading table and read it herself, standing at the table in the early morning, and had gone quietly about her work afterward with a face that gave nothing, because she had in fact formed opinions about most of the things that happened in this house. And her opinion of this situation, in particular, had been forming since the 2nd week of September. She found Georgiana in her room with a half-packed trunk, and a face that showed 3 weeks of accumulated composure about to reach its limit. She said without preamble, "He's read the page, miss. The one on the table. He's read it in the drawing-room to the assembled company, and named you as its author." Georgiana set down the folded gown she was holding. She asked in a voice that came out very level, "In front of Lady Dorothea and Miss Brant, Mrs. Brant," Partlow said, "and 40 guests." The silence in the room lasted 4 seconds. Georgiana said, "He will have caused himself a considerable difficulty. He is a duke, Mrs. Robb." Partlow said, with the mild tone of someone observing an obvious fact, "He can manage difficulties considerably larger than this one." Georgiana looked at the trunk. She looked at the candle on the narrow table. She looked at the leather case under the writing table, which was the thing she had carried through 3 years, and 2 addresses and 3 weeks of hiding the act of filling it. She went downstairs. She entered the drawing-room from the far door, and the room turned to look at her with a particular attention that had been building since the Duke's reading. The chandelier light was very bright after the corridor. She found Edmund at the far side of the room, and he crossed to meet her before she had taken 4 steps, which was again not his custom, and which the room noted. He stopped close enough for conversation. He held the page she had written the night before. He said, "Mrs. Partlow tells me you were packing. My formal reason for remaining at Ravenhill will be resolved in one direction or another shortly," she said. It seemed practical to be prepared. "Lady Maren has asked me to tell you," he said, "that she has no intention of resolving her illness with any particular urgency until she has heard the end of your story." Something happened in Georgiana's throat. She managed to hold her expression steady. He said more quietly, "I would also like to tell you that the room in this house which produces the best work is considerably more available to you than Lady Dorothea indicated. It has in fact been available to you since your first morning here. I was unaware that anyone had suggested otherwise, and I should have made its availability plain at the outset." He paused. "I am making it plain now." "In front of 40 people," she observed. "I find," he said, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite the expression she had been writing about, but was adjacent to it, was she thought its first occasion of being visible in company, that the audience lends a certain clarity to the position. There was more said that evening. Before the musicians resumed, and the company found its way back to its ordinary business of conversation and movement, there was a conversation of some duration in the quieter part of the gallery, where the candles were fewer and the sound of the room did not quite reach, in which 2 people said things they had been constructing, across 9 weeks of proximity, and manuscript pages, and early morning libraries, without knowing they were constructing them. It was not a long conversation. Neither of them were people who required length to be precise. It was a conversation in which Georgiana learned certain things about a chair near a north-facing window, and a woman named Clara, and 3 years of avoiding a room. And Edmund learned certain things about a leather case, carried through 3 addresses, and the particular quality of solitude that produces work worth reading. And both learned, by the end of it, that they had been reading the same sentence from opposite ends and had arrived at the same word. Miss Brant left Ravenhill the following morning, departing before breakfast in a carriage that Lady Dorothea had arranged with unusual speed. Lady Dorothea herself remained, as was her legal right as a widowed relation of the house, but she remained differently, with a quality of restraint in her social management that had not previously characterized it, and the drawing-room's arrangement on subsequent occasions did not feature a carved chair at the center and a young woman in amber silk composed to receive an introduction. Lady Maren rallied. Somewhat in November, which she attributed to narrative investment, and ate 4 decent meals in the following fortnight, which Mrs. Stagg Partlow attributed to better management of the kitchen's dietary provisions for invalids, and both explanations were permitted to coexist. The solicitor from York came on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the ball. Georgiana was not present at the meeting, which was conducted in the Duke's study with the door closed. She was in the library at the north-facing window, writing. When Edmund came to find her afterward, she heard him pause in the doorway for a moment before entering, the way one pauses on the threshold of a room that has been returned to you, and she looked up from her notebook and waited. He said, "There is a question I have been intending to ask you, and the solicitor has confirmed there is no procedural obstacle to asking it." She set her pen down. He asked the question. He asked it in the short, level way he asked things, without preface or ornament, which she had come to understand was not coldness but the opposite, a precision reserved for things that mattered enough to be stated without decoration. She thought about the November morning she had packed the trunk and the leather case, and sat at the short writing table in her room with a candle, writing the last page. She thought about what she had written there, which was that the feeling had been real, and that was sufficient, that she had not expected anything beyond the reality of it. She said yes. She said it in the level way. She said things that mattered. And he crossed to the window where she sat, and took her hand with a care that was slightly in excess of what the gesture required, because its value was not apparent to the room but was entirely apparent to her. If the account of what happened next at Ravenhill touches you in any way, leave a word in the comments. Stories like this one persist because people take a moment to say so. Stay through the ending. The snow came before December. It came overnight, the way the first proper snow usually comes to the North Yorkshire moors, without particular announcement, and by morning, the copper beeches were white to the branch, and the gravel drive had been erased, and the estate's pale stone held a quality of cold, clean light that was different from all the other qualities of light Georgiana had. But noting in her notebooks in September, she was in the library. She had been in the library since 7 o'clock, as was now her habit, except that the circumstances of the 7 o'clock library were somewhat altered from the circumstances of the previous 7 o'clock libraries in her experience of the house. There was a second writing desk in the room. Edmund had moved it from the study 3 days after the ball and positioned it beside his own, at a slight angle to share the north window's light without either desk casting a shadow on the other's page. He had not made a ceremony of its installation, he had simply moved it, with the help of a footman, and asked her if the angle suited her, and she had said it suited her very well. His desk was empty this morning. He had gone out to speak with the groundskeeper about the snow's effect on the eastern drainage, which was an annual concern, and she expected him back before 9. Her notebook was open. She was writing the passage she had been building toward for 3 weeks, the one she had not been able to finish until she knew how it ended, which she now knew. It was the passage about what happens when the woman at the window is finally seen. Not the fear of it, and not the wanting of it below the fear, but the actual experience of it, landing the way it reorganizes everything that has been constructed to survive its absence. She was writing when she heard his step in the corridor. She did not stop writing. She heard him cross the room, and she heard him pause behind her for a moment to read over her shoulder, which was a liberty he had taken twice before, and which she had decided, on the second occasion, to permit without comment, because the alternative was to indicate that it unsettled her, and she had determined she would not do that on grounds that were more complicated than she wished to examine. In the middle of a paragraph, he moved to his own desk. He sat. He opened the volume he had brought in and began reading. The library was quiet around them, snow pressing the silence closer against the windows, the fire that Mrs. Partlow had laid before 6 sending its warmth evenly across the room. On the sill to the left of Georgiana's desk, where the light came in at its longest angle in the morning, a candle stood in a plain holder, still burning from the night before, its flame so steady in the draft-free air that it barely moved. Georgiana wrote the last sentence of the passage. She read it back to herself once in the privacy of her own attention, and found it accurate. She did not say this aloud. She set down her pen and looked up at the snow through the north window, at the white moors going all the way to the horizon in the cold morning light, and she thought that the library, which had been forbidden, and then borrowed, and then lost, and then given back, was hers now, in the most complete sense the word allowed, which was not the legal sense, but the truer one. She picked up her pen again. The candle on the sill burned without wavering. She was home.